And we're back. How was your spring break? Mine was filled with lots of internet organizing. I hope you guys are doing well, and the week ahead kind of looks like this. So I'll post a video or two here and there, and the goal is every day we're going to do one online FRQ, which will take 20 minutes. I know that's asking a lot, but the College Board has kind of changed their AP exam plan, and now you are only responsible for one 45-minute test, and it's only going to be FRQs. That's really, really good news for us, because it means that you guys don't need to stress about how much needs to get done, and I also think FRQs are our strong suit, so I'm pretty excited. Without further ado, Unit 4, Political Processes. Behold, all of Unit 4 in as few minutes as possible. We'll see how it goes. Unit 4 is basically about political geography, which is this concept of sovereignty, statehood, so on and so forth. You know, it's kind of my jam, so I'm glad we're sharing this time together. It kind of begins with the types of entities you get in politics, which sound spicy, but they're not too bad. The first is the nation, which is a group of people that share common culture. The second is a nation state, which is effectively a country where everybody is of one culture. So Japan, for example, where it's fairly homogenous in cultural makeup. Stateless nations are groups of people that don't have political sovereignty, and yet they are still a nation. So the Palestinians, the Kurds, for example, the Scots, they don't have their independence, they don't have a formal country with boundaries, but they do in fact share that cultural connection. Multinational states are states with many national identities. The United States is very much multinational. Lots of different cultures. We're basically a melting pot. Autonomous regions are self-governing. So, for example, the Nunavut in Canada is an autonomous region of indigenous people. And then semi-autonomous is the same thing, but slightly less total control. So, for example, the Indian reservations in the United States, which still are subject to federal laws in sort of an indirect way, but nevertheless they have their own ability to make decisions, have law enforcement, judicial system, that kind of stuff. The political processes that are really common themes in this section are going to be sovereignty, nation states, and self-determination. Sovereignty refers to your ability to have your own control, authority over your own land, policies, people, resources. Nation states are exactly what we mentioned up here, which is countries that are homogenous in nature. And then finally, self-determination, the ability to act unilaterally without having to answer to a more powerful force. They're influenced by the history of colonialism and imperialism. Colonization refers to this concept of siphoning resources back to some sort of major country or homeland, hashtag the United Kingdom, historically, kind of pilfering the United States, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. Imperialism is more about political control and less about the siphoning. So here we see control, and there still might be some siphoning, but the goal is political control over time. Neo-colonization, by the way, is more about corporations than it is about governments. So you see a corporation like ExxonMobil controlling the entire economy of a certain country rather than a foreign country doing the exact same thing. Independence movements are happening worldwide. This would be like the Catalonians in Spain, but also other regions as well. We see the Texans in the United States have built in their constitution that they like this idea of the ability to secede, although that's never going to happen. People like autonomy, so whenever they're given the choice, they tend to trend that way, at least in modern times. Devolution is this idea that power is trickling down. It was on an FRQ last year, and it means that power is going to the local unit rather than the national or federal government. So we're seeing this especially common in places with lots of centrifugal forces where people want autonomy and the control of their own region rather than having some big player national organization telling them what to do. Cool. Territoriality refers to this idea of control over people, land, and resources. In the modern world, it's more about trade and economics than it is about anything else. This is happening through neo-colonialism, those major corporations controlling Earth, especially in the data realm with Facebook, Google, so on and so forth, kind of pilfering every aspect of our existence and trying to sell that data to politicians running for office or other corporations that will exploit our data for their own means. Shadow belts are this concept of countries which are stuck between two rival superpowers. So I believe in a previous video we discussed the Caucasus region, but there are also other shadow belts in the world too. I would argue that Ukraine is. You could even argue that kind of Mongolia is. It's a buffer state. And it just means you're between these two rival conflicting powers and you kind of break up all the culture and power diffuses. And this causes a lot of tension in the region because You have those rivals competing, and also you're divided as well, kind of stuck in the middle, which leads to this concept of a choke point, wherein we have physical geography, social geography, kind of restraining the diffusion of culture, economics in a specific region. There are lots of choke points on Earth. Crimea would be one. But I would also argue the Korean Peninsula is one as well. It's just where we restrain what's actually happening by some other physical force. Could be a trade agreement, honestly. But there are physical geography reasons, mostly peninsulas, mountain ranges, so on and so forth, like Patagonia. Boundaries that are super common, these are the evolution of boundaries. The first one would be relic. I've seen it spelled with a T occasionally. That means historical in nature, so not necessarily there, but it might have a lingering effect, like the Berlin Wall or the Great Wall of China. Superimposed means your boundary literally disregards the culture in the region. So most of the boundaries in Africa, for example, are superimposed. They're pretty linear, and it looks like a person just like randomly drew a bunch of squares. That's because that's basically what happened, totally disregarding indigenous cultures, leading to further conflict down the line. Antecedent means the boundary predates the political unit, so that would be like the Nile River, or a mountain range, and the boundary kind of falls along that line politically because there was no option. People couldn't traverse the object itself. Subsequent and consequent, these refer to boundaries which are changing after or as a result of culture. So as a war is going on, for example, Vietnam, and there's this clash between democratic forces and communist forces, and the boundary changes over time relative to, subsequent to, consequent to, those cultures clashing and wanting to take that space. Geometric boundaries sounds like geometry, that's because that's what it is. It refers to those straight boundaries on the exam. It's usually referring to the North American boundary between the United States and Canada, America's hat, if you will. Cool. The functions of boundaries are kind of not a big deal, but for the most part, we need to know what these words mean. Delimited, demarcated, administered. This refers to political units like a government or a group of people, perhaps a business, actually saying, this is what the boundary is, here's where it is, and here's how we're going to protect it. That could be through the use of military resources. It could also be, I love this demarcation. Some countries literally put posts everywhere saying where the boundary is, like a parallel, for example. The famous ones on the exam are going to be the DMZ between North and South Korea, which is basically a function of the Korean War. It's like the most heavily fortified boundary on Earth to this day, and it's kind of this division between the U.S. government's forces in South Korea and North Korea wanting to be, kind of an isolationist, autocratic democracy. The Berlin Wall is a relic boundary that separated East and West Berlin, function and relic of World War II. And then finally, the Supranationalist Agreement of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is an international boundary document over the waters. And the thing you need to know about that is specific to these exclusive economic zones. Everybody that's a signatory, that means a member of the agreement. The United States, by the way, is not a member of the agreement because we didn't want to give up our sovereignty. We didn't want these other countries in the agreement to tell us what to do. So effectively, if you're in the agreement, you can take any resources within 200 nautical miles of your coast. And this becomes really important in places like the South China Sea, where there are lots of countries that are super close to each other. And China's building literal islands to extend their EEZ, and also taking territory within the Indian Ocean region itself. And that's kind of extending their exclusive economic zone, using UNCLOS not only as like a carrot, but a stick as well, which I find kind of fascinating. Internal boundaries definitely exist, becoming extremely relevant in 2020. We have a national election upon us. And that's going to look like the census happens every 10 years, by the way. Your parents have to fill out the census. They should have gotten the mail or the website. It is, I believe, required by law. This happens every 10 years. Then your local legislature will effectively craft voting districts for the House of Representatives. And they're going to do this by redistricting where people are in these districts. And effectively the goal is to, whichever party is in power, which in Florida that would be Republicans at the state legislature, their goal is to maintain, I just stepped on a hair weave. That's perhaps ironic. Okay, cool. The goal is to maintain power, and they will do this by redistricting with the objective to maintain political advantage by either packing people into a specific district to reduce the number of districts they win, by cracking those people to kind of spread out where their influence is so they can't win as many districts, or by stacking them, which is just code for a weird shaped district that could be packed or cracked, as the case may be. Always on the exam, very important. Over here, we're going to talk about forms of government for a second, unitary versus federal. A unitary government is going to have lots of centralization of power and basically no division of provinces or lower governments. Meaning, if you look at a map, you won't see a bunch of lines demarcating provinces or regions within that country. A federal government, on the other hand, has this clean division between national, state, and local. We, in the United States, have a, surprise, federal government. And that is because we have a massive amount of land mass, lots of different opinions, and lots of regional control. That's what federalism looks like. Unitary would be Florida doesn't matter, Washington, D.C. tells us what to do in every aspect of our life, which could be good, also terrifying. Causes of devolution, by the way, devolution is fairly spicy and often tested. It's represented highly in Unit 4, so we need to master it, and that's kind of the objective. Otherwise, you probably should not show up on game day. Okay, causes of devolution, physical geography. If there are mountains everywhere, if it's kind of hard to interact with people, your cultures are going to develop differently. And, the occasional Grand Canyon might cause a rift in culture, which we see in the United States until the innovation of the internet, of course. Ethnic separatism and cleansing, those are obviously terrible things. That's why you get things like the Lost Boys in Sudan. But effectively, if people are seeking to differentiate themselves, they see their culture as superior versus inferior in another culture. That could lead to lots of loathing and infighting, discrimination, persecution, that kind of stuff. And that causes people to feel like they need to balkanize, to kind of dissipate the country into smaller units, like we saw in Yugoslavia. Economic, social problems. Economic inequality is a huge source of devolution. If we see that a certain group of people is often much more wealthy than another group, then clearly those groups can't get along, and probably they're going to vote differently. Their behaviors, what they buy, how they trade, will also be different as well. And then finally, this idea of terrorism. I have two things, not finally. Terrorism's the penultimate thing. Obviously causes devolution. If you feel like you can't be safe walking down the street, then you're probably not going to like your country, and you might actually seek to separate into a smaller unit with less terrorism. If you feel like the federal government, a unitary government, can't protect you, who needs it? This one, which I've underlined, put a weird exclamation point. Irredentism. It hasn't been tested heavily, and I think we're looking at something which could come up this year. It refers to this feeling of you feeling comfortable with a neighboring state because you guys share history or language together. So, for example, if the Canadians and the people of the United States, we do share a lot of history. Canada is still a Commonwealth country. The U.S. was, a part of the United Kingdom. Also, we both kind of speak English mostly, except for the Quebecois. And as a consequence, maybe someday Canada or the U.S. will seek to also share political boundaries. That's irredentism. This notion that we believe we share this language, this culture, this history. So perhaps we should share space as well. Forces which examples of devolution. Spain, Catalonia is pretty much a hotspot right now. Belgium, which is extremely diverse, that's seeing a lot of devolution going on. Canada, the Quebecois, the Nunavut region. Nigeria, which is seeing a massive division between Christian people in the south and Sunni Muslim people in the north. Best exemplified by the terrorism of Boko Haram, which is basically magnified by the split in population, basically created because of superimposed boundaries. Sudan, a division between Sudan proper and South Sudan, which is backed by the United States government and a lot of foreign aid. Again, this is a split between Islam and Christianity. And then finally, the former Soviet Union, which basically shattered into a million pieces after the United States outspent the Soviet Union and NATO kind of forced the Warsaw Pact to dissipate over time. A heavily diverse country and still pretty diverse to this day. Oh, you'll notice this massive sweeping arrow. It's very pretty. Forces we should care about. Centripetal forces bind a country together. And so, good policy, for example, a good tax scheme where not everybody's paying a lot of money, but they get a bunch of benefits. This causes cohesion. People get excited, they're happy about it, and so they're not discriminating against each other. It's a fairly chillax environment. Was that a good word? Good infrastructure. Good roads, bridges, the ability to get around. These are things which are centripetal, and they also make people pretty happy because they can take care of themselves. And then finally, ethno-nationalism can be both good and bad. This is this idea that you define yourself, you see yourself as a person from a specific place, and you know, relate to it in a positive way. It can be quite negative because ethnic nationalist movements can be heavily discriminatory against a specific group. Classic example, some people are calling this pandemic of COVID-19 the Chinese flu, which is extremely messed up and will almost certainly cause ethnic nationalism in a negative way, meaning people otherizing and dehumanizing the Chinese people in, you know, kind of a negative way, regardless of where the hearth of the actual virus is from. Some centrifugal forces, these are forces which break apart countries, which causes disunity, would be failed states. So if a government is failing, obviously that's going to be centrifugal. If you don't like it, why would you stay there? Stateless nations, that's a group of people that don't have a common political identity. So the Palestinians don't have boundaries. This is a problem because they think Jerusalem also belongs to the Palestinians, but the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, think Jerusalem belongs to them as well. So we have this issue because clearly, you know, they can't get along, and a two-state solution isn't really working. I look like I'm raving a little bit. Wow, this is like beautiful. Uneven development is obviously centrifugal. If people don't share wealth, we have food deserts in poor rural regions, but not in urban communities with greater wealth, then clearly this is going to cause a massive rift between urban and rural populations. And, you know, that's pretty much that jam. Last but not least, I know you guys have hung in, this is an incredibly long, my longest ever YouTube video, would be the rise of supranationalism, which is incredibly important. This refers to international agreements, economic, military alliances, which effectively cause countries to give up their sovereignty to a greater power. Examples on the exam would be the United Nations, which is this concept of like, you know, we're going to defend each other, we're going to intervene in human rights crises. NATO, which is a relic of the Cold War between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka the USSR. And this is kind of this alliance between Europe and the Americas, and it's an economic alliance. So we tend to trade in the same bloc. The European Union, which is also an economic alliance between countries of Europe, and they've created a monetary system as well, which is kind of cool. Best exemplified by the Schengen Agreement, which allows free movement between these European states. So if you want to go to school in one country and not another, and not like go to school where you grew up, then you could just go from like France to Italy. Oh, not right now. and live there without political drama. Just remember, Brexit happened, so the UK is this freaking weave. So the UK is no longer a part of the. I know you guys miss my carpet. Asian, which is the same kind of agreement, this economic agreement between Southeast Asian countries. The Arctic Council, which sounds so much cooler than it is this kind of agreement between countries which share the Arctic. The United States is in there because of #Alaska. We've got Russia, we've got Canada, and a bunch of other countries, Norway. It's super fun. It sounds like the most fun one on here. And then the African Union, similar concept, and all of these are burgeoning economic alliances. With a military twist sometimes. The key thing here is this keeps everybody happy and in good working condition as a country, because if a country acts out of like the scope of how the agreement is set up, then the other countries can do things, sanction, create embargoes if things get wild and crazy. I don't think boots on the ground are happening, hopefully not anytime soon, but the goal is through kind of like peer support and influence, everybody gets along, we're all happy and peaceful, and Unit 4. Hope you guys have a great day, and enjoy reflecting on the majesty of this whale shark. Bye-bye.